February 15, 1945. A troop train rattled through the frozen landscape of southern Pennsylvania, carrying 200 German prisoners of war toward a processing facility in Maryland. The wheels clacked against the rails with metronomic precision, each rotation marking distance from the conflict zones and proximity to an uncertain peace. In one of the passenger cars, third from the front, Sergeant Isaac Woodard of the United States Army sat in full uniform, his service ribbons testament to 15 months of exemplary duty in the Pacific Theater. The war in Europe was entering its final months, and the routine transport of captured enemy soldiers had become as common as morning coffee. Steam from the locomotive drifted past the windows, momentarily obscuring the bare trees and snow-covered fields that stretched to the horizon. What nobody on that train could have imagined was that a single moment of confrontation would expose contradictions so profound that they would echo through courtrooms, newspapers, and the conscience of a nation for decades to come. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a simple instruction from a train conductor would transform into a flashpoint that revealed the deep ironies of fighting for freedom abroad while confronting inequality at home, forcing everyone present to reckon with questions that no military manual could answer. Isaac Woodard had been born in 1919 in Fairfield County, South Carolina, the grandson of people who had known the chains of enslavement. His grandmother had told him stories about the old days, stories that made his skin prickle with a mixture of horror and disbelief. She described auction blocks and separation of families, the sound of the whip and the taste of fear that became as familiar as breathing. His parents had worked the red clay soil until their hands were leather and their backs bent like question marks. They had picked cotton from dawn until the light failed, their fingers bleeding, their bodies aching, their spirits sustained only by the hope that their children might know a different life. Isaac had watched his father come home every evening, too exhausted to speak, had seen his mother wash clothes for white families to earn the extra dollars that meant the difference between hunger and survival. He had escaped that future by enlisting in October 1942, drawn by the promise of steady pay and the chance to prove himself in service to his country. He had never imagined himself a soldier, but the uniform had given him something his father had never possessed: recognition as a man worthy of respect. Over 15 months, Sergeant Woodard had served with the 692nd Central Postal Directory Battalion, a segregated unit responsible for the massive logistics of military mail. While white soldiers often dismissed such assignments as rear echelon duty, the reality demanded precision, endurance, and unshakable reliability. The Postal Battalion processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per day, routing correspondence from training camps in Texas to foxholes in France, from hospitals in England to homes in Iowa. Millions of letters passed through their hands, final words from dying men, birth announcements delivered to fathers who would never meet their children, divorce papers that ended marriages from 7,000 miles away, love notes scrawled in foxholes with hands that still trembled from combat. Each piece of mail represented a thread, connecting the war's vast machinery to the human hearts that powered it. A letter delivered on time could save a marriage or prevent a suicide. A package that arrived intact could remind a soldier that somewhere people still lived normal lives and waited for his return. Woodard had proven himself exceptional at this work, earning his sergeant's stripes through meticulous attention and quiet leadership that inspired his men without requiring raised voices or threats. He had served in New Guinea, where the humidity made paper stick to your fingers, and mosquitoes carried diseases with names he could not pronounce: dengue fever, malaria, scrub typhus. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on your shoulders and made every breath feel like work. The jungle grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor, creating a green twilight that persisted throughout the day. He had processed mail in the Philippines, where the ground still trembled from recent combat, and the smell of cordite hung in the air like morning fog, mixing with the scent of tropical flowers in a combination that would haunt him for years. He had watched young men receive letters that made them weep with joy or collapse with grief, had learned to recognize which envelopes contained heartbreak before they were even opened. The thin paper, the unfamiliar handwriting, the official stamps, these details told their own stories. He had learned that in war the smallest kindnesses, a letter delivered on time, a package kept dry through monsoon rains, a message that reached its destination despite administrative chaos, could mean the difference between hope and despair. During his service, Woodard had developed a reputation among the men as someone who could be trusted. When Private Jackson from Alabama received word that his father had died and the family farm was being sold, it was Woodard who helped him compose the letter home, who found the right words to express grief and reassurance simultaneously. When Corporal Martinez from New Mexico needed to send money to his mother but could not navigate the complex procedures, Woodard walked him through every step. When the entire battalion faced an inspection that could determine their next assignment, Woodard organized the preparations with such efficiency that the inspecting officer commended their commander, though Woodard received no official recognition for his role. Now in February 1945, Sergeant Woodard was finally going home. His discharge papers sat in his jacket pocket, crisp and official, stamped with seals and signatures that transformed him from soldier to civilian. In 3 days, he would be a free man again, able to build the life he had dreamed about during those long Pacific nights when sleep came hard and memories felt more vivid than present reality. He planned to marry Emma, the woman who had written him 217 letters. He had counted everyone, had stored them in a waterproof pouch and read them so many times that he could recite passages from memory. Emma worked as a seamstress in the Bronx, her fingers as skilled with needle and thread as his had become with sorting mail. Her letters had sustained him through the darkest moments, had reminded him that somewhere beyond the jungle, humidity and the combat zones, life continued with all its ordinary beauty. They would move to New York, where he had heard a black man could find decent work, and walk down the street without stepping aside for anyone. The future seemed to stretch before him like an open road, full of possibility and promise. The train had departed from Camp Gordon in Georgia that morning, leaving at 6:15 precisely. Woodard had watched the camp disappear behind them, feeling relief mixed with something like nostalgia. He had spent the last 2 weeks at Camp Gordon processing his discharge, attending briefings about veteran benefits, receiving his final pay. The camp had felt like purgatory, no longer truly military but not yet civilian, existing in the liminal space between identities. Now, finally, he was in motion toward his new life. The train carried a mixed cargo of soldiers heading home, prisoners heading to detention, and civilians going about their ordinary business. The German prisoners occupied the rear cars, guarded by military police with rifles they rarely needed to display. Most of the captured soldiers seemed relieved to be out of the conflict, grateful for warm meals and shelter from the winter cold. They were farm boys from Bavaria who had been drafted at 17, factory workers from the Ruhr who had survived the firebombing of their cities, clerks from Berlin who had never wanted to fight but had been given no choice. Some were true believers who still maintained that their cause had been righteous despite defeat. Others were simply exhausted men who wanted only to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. They sat in their designated cars, playing cards or sleeping or staring out windows at a landscape that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the ruins they had left behind. In the passenger section, Sergeant Woodard sat beside a window in the 3rd row from the front, watching the landscape roll past. The industrial cities of the South gave way to the rolling farmland of the mid-Atlantic. Bare trees stood like skeletons against the grey sky, their branches forming intricate patterns against the clouds. Patches of snow clung to the northern slopes, where sunlight could not reach, creating a patchwork of white and brown that looked like an enormous quilt thrown across the hills. Farmhouses dotted the landscape, smoke rising from their chimneys in vertical columns on this windless day. He tried to imagine what Emma's face would look like when he appeared at her door, but the image kept dissolving into memory fragments, the way she laughed with her whole body, the smell of her hair when they had danced at the church social before his deployment, the pressure of her hand in his during the long walk home. He wondered if she had changed, if the 2 years of separation had transformed her in ways her letters could not convey. He wondered if he had changed too much, if the things he had seen and done had marked him in ways that would be visible to her. Around him, Other soldiers dozed or played cards or wrote letters that would be processed by men like him, sent halfway around the world to reach someone who waited. A young private across the aisle, white, maybe 19 years old, was writing to someone named Mary, his pen moving slowly across the paper as he searched for words adequate to whatever he was trying to express. An older sergeant near the back was sleeping with his mouth open, snoring softly, his head tilted against the window in a way that would give him a terrible crick in his neck. Two corporals were playing gin rummy on a jacket spread across their laps, their voices low as they trash-talked each other with the easy familiarity of men who had served together for months. The train's rhythm was hypnotic, clickety-clack, clickety-clack, each revolution of the wheels carrying him closer to freedom. He had purchased a ticket for this leg of the journey, paying his own money to ride in relative comfort rather than in the military transport trucks that would eventually carry him from the train station to the discharge center. After 15 months of cots and tents and the constant proximity of other men's bodies and breath, he craved a few hours of peace. The seat had cost him $2.35, nearly a full day's pay. But it was worth it for the chance to sit quietly and watch the world pass by and prepare himself mentally for the transformation from soldier to civilian. The trouble began just after noon, somewhere between Richmond and Washington. The train had stopped briefly in Richmond to take on water and allow passengers to stretch their legs. Woodard had stepped onto the platform, feeling the cold February air on his face, grateful for the sensation after the stuffy warmth of the passenger car. He had purchased a sandwich from a vendor, ham and cheese on rye bread, with mustard that was too sharp, but still tasted better than anything he had eaten in months. He had watched other passengers coming and going, families reuniting with soldiers, businessmen rushing to make connections, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Then the whistle had blown and everyone had scrambled back aboard, and the train had lurched into motion again. The conductor was a man named Albert Morrison, 53 years old with thinning hair and a mustache that had gone grey around the edges. He had worked for the railroad for 28 years, long enough to know every mile of track and every station master by name. He had started as a baggage handler when he was 25, had worked his way up through various positions, had survived the Depression by accepting reduced wages when others had been laid off. He moved through the car with the practiced efficiency of someone who had punched 10,000 tickets, his eyes scanning for discrepancies or problems. He knew instinctively which passengers would cause trouble, which ones would need assistance, which ones he could safely ignore. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict problems before they occurred, to diffuse conflicts before they escalated, to maintain order through a combination of authority and careful observation. When he reached Sergeant Woodard's seat, he stopped. Morrison looked at the sergeant, then at the window seat beside him, then back at the sergeant again. His expression was difficult to read, not quite hostile, not quite neutral. Something harder to define, like the look a man gives a piece of furniture that has been placed in the wrong room. He seemed to be calculating something, weighing options, considering consequences. Then Morrison said, "I need you to move to the back of the car." Sergeant Woodard looked up at him, confused. He had purchased his ticket legally. His fare had been accepted by the clerk at Camp Gordon without question or comment. The seat he occupied had been empty when he boarded, and no reservation system allocated specific places on this particular train. The request made no sense within the framework of normal railroad operations. Perhaps Morrison had confused him with someone else. Perhaps there was some administrative error that needed to be corrected. "I have a ticket," Woodard said. His voice was calm, the tone of a man stating an obvious fact and expecting the confusion to be quickly resolved. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The muscles in his face shifted in a way that suggested he was controlling anger or frustration or some other emotion that he could not allow to show fully. "That does not matter," he said. "We need this section for the prisoners. You will have to move back." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. For several seconds, Sergeant Woodard simply stared at the conductor, trying to process what he had heard. The German prisoners, the men his country had defeated in combat, the soldiers who had served the regime that had plunged the world into catastrophic conflict, who had fought for a system dedicated to racial hierarchy and totalitarian control, needed his seat. And he, A United States Army sergeant in full uniform with 15 months of honorable service and a discharge that testified to his exemplary record, was being told to give up the space he had paid for with his own money. The logic was so inverted, so fundamentally wrong, that it took him a moment to fully comprehend what was happening. He thought perhaps he had misheard. Perhaps Morrison had said something else, and Woodard had misunderstood in the noise of the moving train. But no, the conductor's expression confirmed it. This was exactly what it seemed to be. Around them, other passengers began to notice the exchange. Conversations died away like candles being snuffed out one by one. Card games paused, hands held in mid-air. The young private who had been writing to Mary put down his pen and watched. The sleeping sergeant woke up, disturbed by the sudden silence. The entire car seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Woodard felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. It was not quite anger, not quite disbelief. It was the terrible weight of recognition, the understanding that some truths are so fundamental that they cannot be argued away or reasoned with. This was not a misunderstanding that could be clarified. This was not a mistake that could be corrected. This was the reality of the country he had served, revealing itself with brutal clarity. He had spent 15 months serving his country, processing the mail of white soldiers who would never have to defend their right to sit where they had paid to sit. He had endured the casual indignities of segregated units, separate facilities, the constant reminders that his service was appreciated, but his equality was not assured. The segregated water fountains and restrooms, the whites-only restaurants where he could not eat despite wearing his uniform, the buses where he had to sit in the back, even when the front was empty. He had told himself that these were temporary inconveniences, that once the conflict ended, once he returned home in uniform with his honorable discharge and his service ribbons, things would be different. He had believed, perhaps foolishly, but genuinely, that his service would earn him the respect that was supposedly guaranteed to all citizens, but so often denied in practice. But here, on a train rolling through the country he had served, a conductor was telling him that captured enemy soldiers deserved his seat more than he did. The irony was so sharp it could cut. Sergeant Woodard stood up slowly. He was not a large man, 5 feet 8 inches, 157 pounds, with the lean build of someone who had spent months in tropical heat on limited rations, but he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that how you stand matters more than how tall you are. His grandmother had taught him that. She had told him stories about people who had endured unimaginable degradation, but had never let it break their sense of self-worth. She had shown him how to hold his head up, even when the world was pressing down. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear enough for everyone in the car to hear. "I paid for this seat," he said. "I'm a sergeant in the United States Army. I have served my country honorably for 15 months in the Pacific Theater. And you are telling me to give my seat to prisoners, to men who fought against everything this country claims to stand for." Morrison's face flushed red, starting at his collar and spreading upward until even his ears had darkened. "The rules are the rules," he said, though his tone suggested he knew how hollow those words sounded, how insufficient they were as justification for what he was demanding. Then Woodard said something that would be remembered and repeated, that would appear in newspaper accounts and court testimonies and historical records. That would become a small but significant piece of the ongoing story of American democracy, struggling with its own contradictions. He said, "I did not serve my country, so I could be treated worse than the enemy." The simplicity of the statement was devastating. It contained no profanity, no threat, no appeal to pity or special consideration. It was merely an observation, a comparison so obvious and irrefutable that it could not be dismissed or explained away. In 14 words, Sergeant Woodard had exposed the central contradiction of American democracy in 1945, that black soldiers could fight and die for freedom abroad while being denied basic dignity at home, that the nation could proclaim universal human rights while enforcing racial hierarchies, that service and sacrifice could be demanded without guaranteeing the equality they supposedly defended. Morrison had no response. What could he say? That the rules made sense, that Woodard should accept his inferior status gracefully. That fighting for your country did not earn you the right to occupy the same space as captured enemy soldiers. Any response would only deepen the contradiction, would only make more visible the absurdity of the situation. Instead, Morrison simply repeated, "You need to move. Now." His voice had acquired an edge, a hardness that suggested the conversation had moved beyond policy into something more personal. He was a man whose authority had been challenged, and in his world, such challenges could not be tolerated without losing the respect that made his position possible. Other passengers were watching now with undisguised attention. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact, perhaps recognizing the injustice, but unwilling to involve themselves in a confrontation that could bring its own consequences. Others watched with open curiosity, waiting to see if the sergeant would comply or resist, treating the scene like entertainment rather than a moment of profound moral significance. A few white soldiers in the car exchanged glances, perhaps recognizing the absurdity of the situation, but uncertain whether to intervene. Speaking up would mean challenging the conductor's authority and potentially exposing themselves to similar treatment. Silence was safer, easier, more in line with the established order of things. One of the German prisoners, a young man with straw-colored hair who sat several rows back in the section designated for captured enemy personnel, watched the confrontation with evident confusion. His name was Klaus Richter, 21 years old, from a small farming village outside Munich. He did not speak much English, but he understood enough to grasp the basic situation. The black sergeant was being forced to surrender his seat so that prisoners like himself could sit more comfortably. In Germany, during his training, he had been told that America was the land of equality and freedom, the nation that claimed to fight for universal human rights against totalitarian oppression. This scene did not match that description at all. If anything, it reminded him of things he had seen in his own country. The rigid hierarchies, the casual cruelties, the way some people were treated as inherently inferior, regardless of their actions or achievements. He felt uncomfortable being the indirect beneficiary of this injustice, though he had no power to change it and no clear understanding of how to express his discomfort. Sergeant Woodard did not move. He stood in the aisle, his hands at his sides, his expression calm but immovable. It was a quiet form of resistance, not violent, not even particularly dramatic, simply the refusal to comply with an instruction that violated basic human dignity. He had made a calculation, rapid and instinctive, weighing the cost of compliance against the cost of resistance. Compliance would mean accepting his own degradation, confirming his inferior status, teaching himself that submission was the price of peace. Resistance might bring consequences he could not predict, but at least he would maintain his self-respect. Some insults could not be swallowed without choking on your own self-respect. Morrison left the car, walking quickly toward the front of the train, with the stiff gait of a man trying to maintain composure while feeling his authority slip away. Woodard knew what was coming. The conductor would find someone with greater authority. A police officer, a station master, perhaps military police who could enforce the demand that civilian authority could not. The confrontation would escalate. The stakes would rise, but Woodard had made his decision and would not retreat from it. The other passengers returned to their activities, though the atmosphere in the car had changed fundamentally. What had been a routine journey now carried a tension that made everyone hyper-aware of their surroundings, conscious that they were witnessing something significant, even if they could not articulate exactly what. The soldiers who had been playing cards put their decks away, no longer able to focus on the game. The woman across the aisle clutched her purse more tightly, as if the social disruption might somehow threaten her physical safety. The young private who had been writing to Mary sat with his pen hovering over the paper, unable to find words for what he was witnessing. Everyone sensed that something important was happening, though most could not have explained exactly what or why it mattered. 15 minutes later, Morrison returned with 2 military police officers. They were white men, both corporals, both armed with sidearms. They had never expected to draw on a domestic train full of passengers and prisoners being transported under guard. They approached Sergeant Woodard with the cautious formality of men who understood that this situation was more complicated than it first appeared, that there were regulations and protocols and chains of command that might be relevant. that a wrong move could create problems extending far beyond this single train car. The senior corporal, a man named Robert Jenkins from Dayton, Ohio, said, "Sergeant, we have been asked to resolve a situation here. The conductor says you are refusing to follow his instructions." Jenkins was 26 years old, a career soldier who had enlisted in 1941 and survived combat in North Africa and Italy. He had seen men die for inches of worthless ground, had held dying friends while they bled out from wounds no medic could treat, had learned that war was mostly terror and boredom with brief interludes of chaos. He had never imagined that his duties would include confronting a fellow sergeant over a train seat, that the military police skills he had developed would be deployed in this particular context. He felt uncomfortable with the situation, but knew he had to resolve it somehow. Woodard met his eyes steadily. "I purchased a ticket for this seat, Corporal. I have done nothing wrong. I am not drunk or disorderly. I have not threatened anyone or violated any regulation. I am being told to move so that prisoners can sit more comfortably. I am asking you, is that a lawful order?" The question was more complex than it seemed. Railroad segregation laws varied by state, and the legal status of military personnel in transit added another layer of complication. Technically, Woodard might be right. There might be no legal authority to force him from a seat he had paid for. But technicalities mattered less than maintaining order and avoiding confrontation. Jenkins knew that his superiors would judge him not on legal fine points, but on whether he had kept the situation from escalating. "Sergeant," Jenkins said, his tone measured and almost apologetic, "I understand your position, but I need you to move to avoid further difficulty. Consider it a request from one serviceman to another, not an order based on regulations." It was a clever approach, framing compliance as a favor rather than submission, appealing to military camaraderie rather than invoking authority that might not actually exist. But Woodard recognized the tactic. He had seen it countless times. The polite phrasing that disguised coercion, the friendly tone that masked an ultimatum, the suggestion that compliance was voluntary when in fact resistance would bring consequences. "With respect, Corporal," Woodard said, "I cannot comply with a request that treats me as inferior to captured enemy soldiers. If you are ordering me to move, state clearly that it is an order and specify on what authority it is based. I want to be absolutely clear about whether I am being asked or commanded, and whether this is based on military regulations or civilian prejudice." The entire car was listening now. Every passenger focused on this exchange with an intensity that made the air feel charged. Even the prisoners in the rear section had fallen silent, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if they could not follow all the details. The train continued its rhythmic progress, clickety-clack, clickety-clack, carrying them all toward a destination that felt increasingly uncertain. Jenkins looked at Morrison, then at his fellow military policeman, then back at Woodard. He was a career soldier. Raised in a small Ohio town where everyone knew their place and disruptions were handled quietly before they became public problems. This kind of standoff was outside his training and experience. The military police manual covered dealing with drunken soldiers, preventing fights, managing prisoners. It said nothing about what to do when a decorated sergeant refused an unjust instruction from a civilian authority. He could order Woodard to move, but what if the sergeant refused? Would he physically remove a fellow serviceman for the comfort of enemy prisoners? What would that look like to everyone watching? How would he justify it in his report? Finally, Jenkins made his decision. He turned to Morrison and said, "Sergeant Woodard may keep his seat. We will make alternative arrangements for the prisoners." Morrison's face turned an even deeper shade of red, the color of a man whose blood pressure had spiked to dangerous levels. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I run this train, and I determine seating arrangements according to company policy and local regulations." Jenkins turned to face him fully, his posture straightening in a way that made clear he was done negotiating. "With respect, sir, you are transporting military personnel under military jurisdiction during a time of conflict. This sergeant has purchased his ticket legally and has done nothing to warrant removal. He has served his country honorably and is entitled to the respect that uniform demands. The matter is closed." Morrison opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. Perhaps he recognized that he had lost, that pushing further would only make his defeat more public. Perhaps he calculated that this battle was not worth the potential consequences. He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with suppressed anger, his footsteps heavy on the floor of the swaying car. The military policeman followed, leaving Woodard standing in the aisle. Slowly, Sergeant Woodard sat back down. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline that follows confrontation, the physiological response to stress that takes time to dissipate. He had won this particular battle, but the victory felt hollow. He knew that Morrison would remember this moment, that there would likely be consequences, that his refusal to submit had marked him as someone who did not know his place. In the South of 1945, such knowledge could be dangerous, but he also knew that he had spoken a truth that needed speaking. And in the quiet murmurs of approval from a few other black passengers scattered throughout the car, a woman in the back who nodded almost imperceptibly, a porter who caught his eye and gave the smallest smile, he recognized that his words had resonated beyond this single moment. He had not stood up for himself alone, but for everyone who had swallowed similar insults, everyone who had been told their place and accepted it because resistance seemed impossible. The train continued northward. Outside the windows, the landscape darkened as afternoon faded toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the snow-covered fields. The sun, low on the western horizon, painted the clouds orange and pink. The German prisoners eventually were seated in a different configuration, the specific arrangements made quietly and without further confrontation. Sergeant Woodard remained in his seat, staring out at the passing farmland and thinking about what awaited him when the train finally stopped. He felt exhausted, as if the confrontation had drained something essential from him. But he also felt a kind of clarity, a sense that he had made a choice that would define who he was in ways that went beyond the immediate moment. But the confrontation was not over. It was merely paused, waiting to resume with greater violence when the train reached its next stop. When the train pulled into Batesburg, South Carolina, just after 8 o'clock that evening, Sergeant Woodard prepared to disembark for a brief rest stop. The station was small, just a platform and a waiting room, with a single officer on duty to maintain order and handle any problems that might arise. The temperature had dropped with the sunset, and Woodard could see his breath in the cold air. He wanted to stretch his legs, perhaps buy another sandwich if the station vendor was still operating, maybe use the restroom facilities before the train continued its journey. Simple, ordinary needs that any passenger might have. As Woodard stepped down from the train, his boots making a hollow sound on the wooden platform, he noticed Morrison speaking urgently with the station police officer. The conductor was gesturing toward Woodard, his movements sharp and aggressive, clearly conveying some kind of complaint or accusation. The police officer listened, nodding, his hand moving unconsciously to the baton at his belt in a gesture so habitual it seemed almost reflexive. The police officer was named Linwood Lanier Shull, 47 years old, a former farmer who had taken the police position to supplement his income when farming became economically unviable. He had never received formal law enforcement training beyond a brief orientation about local ordinances and the procedures for making arrests. His authority derived from his willingness to enforce local customs and his reputation for not tolerating disruption or disrespect. In his mind, order meant everyone staying in their assigned place, and people who challenged that arrangement were troublemakers who needed to be taught respect through whatever means proved necessary. Shull had grown up in Batesburg, had never traveled more than 50 miles from his birthplace, had built his entire worldview from the narrow experiences of small-town Southern life in the early 20th century. He understood the world in terms of hierarchies that seemed natural and inevitable to him: white over black, men over women, landowners over workers, natives over strangers. Any challenge to these hierarchies felt like a personal threat, an assault on the order that made his life comprehensible. Morrison pointed at Woodard and said something Woodard could not hear from this distance. Shull nodded, his expression hardening into the look of a man preparing to exercise authority. Then both men began walking toward the sergeant with purposeful strides that suggested this would not be a casual conversation. Woodard felt his stomach tighten. He knew this pattern, had seen it countless times in the South, the white authority figure approaching with accusations already formed, the presumption of guilt that preceded any investigation, the assumption that his version of events would matter less than whatever story had been told by white witnesses. He straightened his shoulders and prepared himself for whatever was coming, trying to maintain the calm dignity that had served him throughout his military service. Charles approached and said, "Boy, you have been causing trouble on this train." The word boy was deliberate, designed to diminish and demean, to reduce a 26-year-old man with 15 months of military service to the status of a child. Woodard had heard it 10,000 times, from white shopkeepers and police officers and random strangers who used it to maintain psychological dominance. It never stopped cutting, never became less insulting through repetition. "Officer," Woodard said carefully, "I am Sergeant Isaac Woodard of the United States Army. I have caused no trouble. I merely insisted on occupying the seat I paid for with my own money. There was a disagreement with the conductor, but it was resolved by military police without incident." He spoke clearly and formally, using the precise language he had learned in the military, trying to establish his credibility and diffuse the situation before it could escalate. But he could see in Charles' eyes that the words were not registering as he intended. The police officer had already made his decision about what kind of person Woodard was and what needed to happen next. Schul's expression hardened further. "You got smart with this conductor," he said. "That is trouble where I come from. Now you are going to come with me and learn some manners." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Woodard's heart began to pound. He could feel the danger in the way Schul's hand gripped his baton, in the set of the man's jaw, in the way Morrison stood slightly behind the officer with an expression of vindicated anger. But what could he do? Run? Where would he go? Fight back? That would only confirm whatever accusations had been made and give legal cover for whatever came next. "Officer," Woodard said, keeping his voice level despite the fear rising in his chest, "I have my discharge papers here. I am traveling home after honorable service. I have committed no crime. On what grounds are you detaining me?" Charles stepped closer, invading Woodard's personal space in a deliberate act of intimidation. "I don't need grounds, boy. This is my station, and I say you are coming with me. Now move." What happened next would become a matter of legal dispute, with testimony contradicting testimony and witnesses recalling different sequences of events. But the essential facts would emerge through hospital records, physical evidence, and the accounts of those brave enough to speak truth despite social pressure to remain silent. Charles ordered Woodard to come with him to the station house. When Woodard asked again what he was being charged with, Charles struck him across the face with his baton. The blow was sudden and brutal, delivered with the full strength of a man who weighed nearly 200 pounds. Woodard stumbled but did not fall, his military training giving him balance even as pain exploded across his cheekbone. Other passengers watched from the train windows, their faces pressed against the glass, some shocked, some curious, some carefully avoiding looking at all. The German prisoners observed silently from their section of the train, perhaps wondering if this was normal in the country that had defeated them. Charles struck Woodard again, this time in the stomach, driving the air from his lungs and doubling him over, then again across the back, and again across the shoulders. The baton rose and fell with metronomic regularity, each blow calculated to cause maximum pain without immediately incapacitating the victim. Charles was an experienced fighter who understood how to hurt someone effectively. Woodard tried to protect himself, raising his arms to shield his head, but this only enraged Charles further. The police officer interpreted any form of defense as resistance, any attempt to minimize harm as an assault on his authority. He struck harder, faster, his breathing becoming labored with exertion, his face flushed with the effort and perhaps with a kind of rage that had been building throughout the confrontation. "Get down," Schul commanded. "Get on the ground like the dog you are." Woodard, dazed and in terrible pain, slowly lowered himself to his knees on the cold wooden platform. The position was humiliating, designed to break his spirit as much as his body. But worse was coming. Charles took the end of his baton and deliberately drove it into Woodard's face, targeting his eyes with terrible precision. He twisted and ground the instrument against the delicate tissues, destroying the optic nerves with brutal efficiency. Woodard screamed, a sound that several witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives, a cry of agony so profound that it seemed to tear the fabric of the evening air. When Shull finally stopped, Sergeant Isaac Woodard was blind. Permanently, irrevocably, completely blind. The attack had lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though time becomes distorted in moments of extreme violence. To Woodard it felt like hours. To the watching passengers, it happened with terrible speed. To Morrison, standing several feet away, it was the natural consequence of a troublemaker who had failed to learn his place. The other officers at the station house claimed later that they had not witnessed the assault, that they had been inside attending to other duties when it occurred. The passengers on the train said they had seen some kind of altercation, but could not make out the details through the darkness and distance and the reflection of interior lights on the windows. The German prisoners who had observed the beginning of the confrontation were never asked to testify, their status as enemy combatants making them unreliable witnesses in the eyes of investigators who had no interest in pursuing the case vigorously. Woodard was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. He spent the night in a cell, unable to see, his face a mass of bruises and lacerations, blood dried on his uniform. The pain was overwhelming, but worse was the darkness, absolute and terrifying, a void where his vision had been. He kept trying to open his eyes, kept expecting his sight to return, kept telling himself this was temporary shock that would heal. But deep down, in a place beyond hope or denial, he knew the truth. In the morning, he was taken before a local judge who found him guilty of disorderly conduct and fined him $50, more than 2 weeks' military pay. Nobody asked about his injuries, nobody provided medical attention. Nobody seemed to think it unusual that a decorated United States Army sergeant in full uniform had been beaten so badly that he could no longer see. The judge pronounced sentence in a bored tone, as if this were the most routine matter imaginable, then moved on to the next case without waiting to see if Woodard had any response. It was only when Woodard was finally released and managed to reach a hospital in nearby Columbia that the full extent of his injuries became clear. The emergency room doctor, a man named Henry Marsh who had treated casualties throughout the conflict, examined Woodard's eyes with growing horror. Dr. Marsh had seen combat wounds, had extracted shrapnel and treated burns and performed amputations. But the deliberate destruction of this man's eyesight appalled him in a way that battlefield injuries never had. The damage to Woodard's eyes was not accidental trauma or collateral damage from combat. It was intentional mutilation carried out with calculated precision. The doctor delivered his verdict with obvious distress. The damage to both optic nerves was irreversible. At age 26, after 15 months of honorable service to his country, Isaac Woodard would spend the rest of his life in darkness. No surgery could repair what had been destroyed. No treatment could restore what had been taken. The blindness was total and permanent. The news of what had happened spread slowly at first, moving through the networks that connected black communities across the country. Woodard's family was notified by an army telegram that arrived 3 days after the assault. His mother read it twice, then 3 times, unable to process the words that transformed her son's triumphant homecoming into tragedy. Emma received word through a phone call from Woodard's sister, and she collapsed to the floor of her apartment, her 217 letters scattered around her like fallen leaves. The future they had planned together dissolved into darkness that mirrored Isaac's new reality. The army launched what it described as an investigation, but the effort was perfunctory at best. Officers interviewed witnesses who claimed to remember nothing or who corroborated Shull's version of events. The official report concluded that Sergeant Woodard had been intoxicated and disorderly, that Officer Shull had used appropriate force to maintain public safety, and that the matter required no further action. The file was stamped classified and buried in bureaucratic archives, where it might have remained forever, except for a sequence of events that nobody could have predicted. But then something extraordinary happened. The story reached the desk of a man named Orson Welles. Welles was already famous as the creator of the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, as the director and star of Citizen Kane, as one of the most recognizable voices in American entertainment. But in the summer of 1946, He was using his radio program to address social issues with the same dramatic flair he had brought to fiction. When he learned about Isaac Woodard's case through contacts in the NAACP, he devoted an entire broadcast to the story on July 28, 1946. The broadcast lasted 15 minutes and reached an estimated audience of several million Americans. Wells described the assault in unflinching detail, named Linwood Shull publicly, and demanded justice with the full force of his considerable rhetorical gifts. His voice, trained for drama and capable of extraordinary emotional range, conveyed both outrage and sorrow as he recounted how a decorated veteran had been blinded for refusing to give his seat to enemy prisoners. Wells said, "If Isaac Woodard had his eyes gouged out in Germany, we would call it a war crime and demand prosecution of those responsible. But this did not happen in Germany. It happened in South Carolina, in the United States of America, to an American soldier wearing an American uniform, and we have done nothing." The broadcast caused an immediate sensation. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Congress members received thousands of letters demanding action. The White House was flooded with telegrams from citizens who had never before contacted their government about racial injustice, but who found Woodard's case impossible to ignore. The combination of Wells's celebrity and the undeniable facts of the case created a perfect storm of public attention that could not be easily dismissed or suppressed. The NAACP recognized the opportunity and moved quickly. Thurgood Marshall, then 38 years old and chief counsel for the organization, began building a legal strategy. Marshall was already well known in civil rights circles for his brilliant legal mind and his willingness to take on seemingly impossible cases. He saw in Isaac Woodard's tragedy not just an individual injustice, but a test case that could establish important precedents about federal authority to protect civil rights, even in states that refused to do so. Marshall met with Woodard multiple times, interviewing him extensively about every detail of the assault. He gathered medical records, tracked down witnesses, built a timeline of events that would be difficult to dispute. He knew that prosecuting a Southern police officer for assaulting a black man would be extraordinarily difficult, that the local legal system would protect its own, that success would require federal intervention and extraordinary legal maneuvering. The investigation revealed details that made the case even more disturbing. It emerged that Shull had bragged about the assault to other officers, describing in graphic detail how he had blinded Woodard as punishment for his insolence. It emerged that Morrison, the train conductor, had lied about the nature of the confrontation, claiming Woodard had been drunk and threatening when in fact he had been sober and respectful. It emerged that multiple witnesses had seen the assault, but had been afraid to come forward, knowing that testifying against a white police officer in the South could bring its own terrible consequences. President Harry Truman learned of the case and was reportedly so disturbed that he ordered the Justice Department to pursue federal charges. Truman, a man from a border state who had grown up with casual racism as an unquestioned part of life, found himself genuinely shocked by what had happened to Sergeant Woodard. He recognized that this was not just about one veteran, but about the fundamental credibility of American democracy in a world emerging from totalitarian conflict. How could the United States claim moral authority over the regimes it had defeated if it allowed such atrocities against its own soldiers? In November 1946, after months of investigation and legal maneuvering, Linwood Shull was finally brought to trial in federal court in Columbia, South Carolina. The charge was violating Sergeant Woodard's civil rights under federal law, a charge that carried serious penalties if conviction could be secured. The trial lasted 4 days and became a media sensation, covered by newspapers across the country and reported in detail by black publications that saw it as a crucial test of whether federal law could protect black citizens when state systems failed to do so. Marshall assembled a powerful case. He called Dr. Marsh, who testified about the horrific nature of Woodard's injuries and the deliberate precision with which they had been inflicted. He called witnesses from the train who described Woodard's calm demeanor and the unjust demand that he surrender his seat. He called military officials who testified to Woodard's exemplary service record. He presented the discharge papers that proved Woodard had been a soldier in good standing. He built a narrative that was impossible to dismiss as mere misunderstanding or justified use of force. The defense strategy was predictable, but effective for its intended audience. Schul's attorney argued that the police officer had been maintaining order in a dangerous situation, that Woodard had been belligerent and threatening, that the injuries were unfortunate but unintentional consequences of necessary force. The attorney painted Woodard as a troublemaker, who had brought his fate upon himself by refusing to comply with lawful instructions. He appealed to the jury's racial prejudices without stating them explicitly, using coded language that everyone in the courtroom understood. Schul himself testified, admitting to striking Woodard, but claiming it had been necessary to subdue a dangerous individual who was threatening passengers and resisting arrest. Under cross-examination, he could not explain why a man who was supposedly drunk and disorderly had managed to maintain his balance and composure throughout the confrontation until the assault began. He could not explain why other officers at the station had not witnessed behavior that warranted such violent intervention. He could not explain why Woodard's injuries were so severe and so precisely located in his eyes if the force had been intended merely to restrain rather than to punish. But none of these contradictions seemed to matter to the jury, 12 white men from South Carolina who had been selected from a pool that excluded black citizens entirely. After all the testimony had been heard, after all the evidence had been presented, after Marshall had delivered a closing argument that brought spectators to tears, the jury deliberated for 30 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. 30 minutes. Less time than it takes to watch a typical television program, less time than it takes to eat a leisurely meal, barely enough time to elect a foreman and take a vote. The message was clear. In the jury's view, a white police officer's authority to punish a black man who stepped out of line was absolute, and no amount of federal law or moral outrage could change that fundamental reality. Isaac Woodard sat in the courtroom and heard the verdict read aloud, though he could not see the faces of the jury members who had decided his suffering warranted no punishment. He sat with perfect stillness, his hands folded in his lap, his sightless eyes fixed on nothing. Emma sat beside him crying quietly, her hand gripping his arm. Around them, spectators reacted with shock or satisfaction, depending on their perspectives. Marshall gathered his papers with practiced calm, though those who knew him could see the tension in his shoulders, the barely controlled anger in the set of his jaw. The story might have ended there, another tragedy buried in the long record of American racial injustice, another case that proved the impossibility of securing justice for black victims of white violence. But the Woodard case continued to resonate in ways that extended far beyond the courtroom. The acquittal generated intense national criticism. Major newspapers published editorials condemning the verdict and questioning whether justice was possible in the South when racial prejudice infected every institution. Civil rights organizations used the case to demonstrate the necessity of federal intervention to protect rights that state systems would not defend. Religious leaders across denominations spoke from their pulpits about the moral obscenity of a legal system that could excuse such brutality. More importantly, the case reached the desk of President Truman and would not leave his thoughts. Truman was not a civil rights crusader by temperament or political calculation. He came from a background where racial hierarchies were simply accepted as natural, but he was also a man with a strong sense of fairness and a belief that military service earned respect regardless of race. The image of a decorated veteran being blinded for asserting his basic dignity haunted him. In July 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The order was revolutionary, dismantling a system of military segregation that had existed since the founding of the Republic. While multiple factors influenced this decision, including Cold War concerns about American credibility and pressure from civil rights organizations, historians agree that the Woodard case played a significant role in Truman's thinking. Truman reportedly told advisors that reading about what happened to Sergeant Woodard made him physically ill and convinced him that fundamental change was necessary. If the military could not protect its own soldiers from such treatment, if a man could serve his country honorably and still be treated as subhuman the moment he returned to civilian life, then the system itself was morally corrupted and required transformation. The desegregation order faced massive resistance from military leadership and from Southern politicians who saw it as federal overreach. But Truman held firm, and over the following years the military slowly integrated. Black soldiers who had served in segregated units during the conflict found themselves serving alongside white soldiers in Korea. The change was imperfect and incomplete, marred by resistance and foot-dragging and creative efforts to maintain informal segregation. But the principle had been established. Military service would no longer be divided by race. Isaac Woodard lived to see these changes, though he experienced them through the descriptions of others rather than through his own vision. He learned to navigate his darkness with extraordinary determination, developing techniques for moving through the world without sight, memorizing the layouts of familiar spaces, learning to identify people by their voices and footsteps. Emma became his eyes, describing the world he could no longer see with such vividness that he could almost visualize it. They married in a small ceremony in the Bronx in 1949, 3 years after the assault that had destroyed his sight but not his capacity for love or hope. Woodard attended events commemorating his case, speaking quietly but firmly about what had happened and what it meant. He never expressed bitterness or called for revenge. When asked how he felt about Scholl's acquittal, he would simply say that he had told the truth and that history would judge both of them according to that truth. He insisted that his story be remembered not as personal tragedy, but as evidence of systemic injustice that required systemic solutions. He became a symbol of both injustice and resilience, appearing at NAACP events and civil rights rallies, his presence a living reminder of the costs of prejudice. When he spoke, people listened with unusual attention, recognizing that his words carried weight, earned through suffering. He did not need to dramatize or exaggerate. The simple facts of his case were more powerful than any rhetorical flourish could make them. Over the following decades, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Woodard's case was frequently cited as an example of the violence that underlay segregation, the casual cruelty that the system enabled and protected. The image of a decorated veteran being blinded for refusing to give his seat to enemy prisoners became a shorthand for the contradictions of American democracy, for the gap between stated ideals and lived reality. He lived to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 become law, dismantling the legal framework of segregation. He lived to see the Voting Rights Act of 1965 guarantee federal protection for black voting rights. He lived to see black Americans elected to Congress, appointed to the Supreme Court, ascending to positions of authority that would have seemed impossible in 1945. The world changed in ways that would have seemed impossible on that February evening when he stood in a train car and insisted on basic dignity. But he also lived to see the limitations of legal change, the ways that formal equality could coexist with informal discrimination. The persistence of prejudice even after segregation had been officially dismantled. He understood that his case had contributed to important transformations, but that the work was far from complete, that each generation would have to fight its own battles for justice. Isaac Woodard died in September 1992 at the age of 73 in the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in the Bronx. By then, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed miraculous to the young sergeant who had stood in that train car and spoken his truth. The military was integrated. Segregation had been legally dismantled. Black Americans could sit wherever they wanted on trains and buses. A black man had been appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in the nation. But the fundamental question Sergeant Woodard had raised with his 14 words remained relevant. What does it mean to serve a country that does not fully recognize your humanity? What does it cost to insist on dignity in systems designed to deny it? How do we reconcile the ideals we proclaim with the realities we enforce? The German prisoners whom Woodard was asked to accommodate eventually returned to their homeland through a complex process of repatriation that stretched over several years. Most resumed ordinary lives in a nation that had been divided and transformed by defeat. Klaus Richter, the young prisoner who had watched the confrontation with such confusion, returned to his village outside Munich and eventually became a schoolteacher. In the 1980s, when a journalist tracked him down and asked about his time as a prisoner in America, he recalled that train incident with striking clarity. Speaking in heavily accented English that he had continued to study after the conflict, Richter said, "We were taught during our training that Americans believed all men are created equal, that this was the foundation of their system. But I saw with my own eyes that this was not true in practice. The sergeant who had fought against us was treated worse than we who had fought against him." This contradiction I could not understand. It made me question everything I had been told about both my own country and about America. If both systems could treat people as inferior based on nothing but their birth, then perhaps the differences between them were smaller than we had been taught to believe. That observation, from a former enemy soldier who had witnessed American hypocrisy firsthand, captured something essential about the Woodard case. It revealed that the United States could not claim moral superiority over the regimes it had defeated while maintaining systems of racial oppression at home. The contradiction was visible even to those who had briefly been enemies, even to people who had every reason to accept American propaganda at face value. The railroad tracks where that train traveled still exist, though passenger service on that particular route ceased decades ago. The station at Batesburg, where Sergeant Woodard was assaulted, is now a small museum that commemorates his story and the broader history of civil rights struggles in South Carolina. Visitors can stand on the same platform where Linwood Shule destroyed Isaac Woodard's site, and they can read detailed accounts of what happened and the consequences that followed. The museum displays Woodard's uniform, his discharge papers, photographs from before the assault, showing a young man with bright eyes and an uncertain smile. They display newspaper clippings about the trial, including the headline that announced Shull's acquittal. They display letters that Orson Welles received after his broadcast, some praising his courage in speaking truth, others condemning him for interfering in Southern affairs. They display the text of Executive Order 9981, with annotations explaining how Woodard's case influenced Truman's decision. Some visitors leave flowers at a memorial plaque that marks the approximate location of the assault. Others leave notes expressing sorrow or solidarity or anger at injustice that happened so long ago but still resonates in contemporary struggles. Still others simply stand in silence, trying to imagine what it would take to speak truth to power when the cost might be everything you have, trying to understand how someone could maintain dignity in the face of violence designed specifically to destroy it. Isaac Woodard's story is not a comfortable one. It does not offer easy redemption or satisfying villains who receive their just punishment. Linwood Shule died in 1977, having lived his entire life in Batesburg without facing legal consequences for his assault on Sergeant Woodard. Albert Morrison, the train conductor whose demand triggered the entire sequence of events, lived until 1981, also without expressing public remorse or acknowledging his role in the tragedy. The system that protected them, that declared their actions acceptable, or at least not criminal, continued to function for decades after Woodard lost his sight. But the story is also one of extraordinary courage, not the courage of combat, where adrenaline and training take over and decisions happen faster than conscious thought, but the courage of moral clarity, the ability to recognize injustice and refuse to participate in your own degradation, even when the cost is catastrophic, the willingness to speak truth, even when powerful forces are arrayed against you, the determination to maintain dignity when every circumstance conspires to strip it away. That kind of courage cannot be taught in boot camp or learned from manuals or acquired through experience. It comes from somewhere deeper, from the bedrock belief that your humanity is non-negotiable, that some prices are too high to pay for peace, that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of violence. Isaac Woodard possessed that courage, and in the moment when he stood in a train car and said, "I did not serve my country so I could be treated worse than the enemy," he performed an act of moral witness that would echo across decades. His words were simple but devastating in their clarity. They exposed a contradiction that could not be explained away or rationalized. They forced a confrontation with truth that many Americans had successfully avoided for generations. They testified to the gap between the nation's ideals and its practices, between the promises made to soldiers and the reality they encountered, between the democracy proclaimed and the hierarchies enforced. And enforcing that confrontation, those 14 words helped change the country. Not immediately, not completely, not without enormous resistance and backlash and the continued suffering of countless others, but change nonetheless, slow, painful, insufficient, but real. The desegregation of the military, the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, the gradual erosion of legal segregation, and the expansion of federal protections for basic rights. These changes did not happen because of Isaac Woodard alone. They happened because of the courage of thousands of people who refused to accept their assigned place, who spoke truth at great cost, who organized and marched and sued and voted and died in the struggle for justice. But Woodard's case was part of that larger movement, and his specific contribution, the clarity of his moral witness, the undeniability of his suffering, the perfect distillation of American contradictions in a single confrontation, helped advance the cause in ways both measurable and immeasurable. When we remember Isaac Woodard today, we remember not just what was done to him, but what he refused to accept. We remember that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to insist on the dignity you already possess. We remember that change often begins with a single person standing up, or in his case refusing to sit down in the place assigned to him and declaring that the existing arrangement is unacceptable. The seat on that train was never really about comfort or space or the logistics of passenger transport. It was about whether a black sergeant who had served his country honorably deserved the same basic respect as captured enemy soldiers. It was about whether American democracy could survive its own contradictions. It was about whether the promise of equality could withstand the test of actual implementation. Sergeant Woodard answered those questions with 14 simple words, and though those words cost him his sight, they helped a nation begin to see truths it had long preferred to ignore. They helped illuminate the gap between ideals and reality. They helped force a reckoning with injustice that the legal system preferred to excuse and society preferred to overlook. That is the legacy of Isaac Woodard, not just his suffering, which was terrible and unjust, but his refusal to let that suffering be meaningless, his insistence that his story be told and remembered and used as evidence in the ongoing struggle for justice, his quiet determination to maintain his humanity and dignity even when powerful forces sought to destroy both. And so we remember. We tell the story of the train and the conductor and the impossible demand. We tell the story of the 14 words and the violence they provoked. We tell the story of the acquittal and the outrage and the slow changes that followed. We tell these stories not because they are comfortable or easy, but because they are true and necessary and still relevant to questions we continue to face about justice and equality and the cost of speaking truth to power. Isaac Woodard's eyes were destroyed, but through his witness he helped a nation begin to see. That paradox, gaining vision through blindness, illuminating truth through suffering, is both tragedy and testament. It reminds us that progress often comes at terrible cost, that justice requires sacrifice, that change demands courage of a kind that most of us hope we will never need to summon. But it also reminds us that such courage exists, that ordinary people in impossible circumstances can choose dignity over submission, truth over comfort, justice over peace. And in making those choices, they can change not just their own lives, but the course of history itself. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.